can't say we've had a conference, because he's been tracked.
Okay, good morning. My name is Joe Sewash. I'm with the North Carolina Center for Geographic Information Analysis. This is the presentation on address NC and local government address maintenance. As we go through today, I want to be able to keep this very open-ended, do questions in the midst of the presentation. It's loosely structured, so if there's more points that you want to make or something that's similar in your organization that you want to raise as a discussion point, feel free to jump in. I'll make sure to also interject some opportunities for questions as we move along. Address NC is really a series of projects that CGA is organizing around the concept of address maintenance, primarily at the state level, but also acknowledging and integrating the requirements of the local government community, as well as various federal agencies that also either come to you directly, overtly for data, or covertly and utilize these data sets. There's a lot of opportunities and a lot of potential for integrating the context of addressing and address management within the enterprise that you're dealing with on a day-to-day basis, as well as the broader scope of statewide initiatives. So we'll spend some time at the front end talking about some of the business case planning that we're working towards in what it takes to do the aggregation components of creating a master address data set at the statewide level, composed of data that's developed and managed at the local government level. We'll talk briefly about a pilot program that's been ongoing for about a year and a half within the Census Bureau to help them prepare for the 2020 census and impacts that will hopefully provide in a positive way for local governments moving forward. Opportunities within the 911 community in terms of address data management in the future. And then also some nuts and bolts of a very specific project that we're working on with the NC Broadband folks, funded through the National Telecommunication and Information Administration, that will give us an updated data set statewide later in the year. So in terms of thinking about addresses and what goes on at the statewide kind of level, what we want to be able to do is to document what are the technical requirements, the business requirements, and what's the value in terms of justifying the investment and effort to be able to create this at a statewide scale. You can see here some areas that we've identified as business drivers for being able to improve quality of the service provision, i.e. a better data set helping us do our jobs better. Efficiency of coordination updates, making sure that where possible, feasible, and practical, that we're not replicating these kinds of processes at the local government level or the state level. Again, reducing the redundant efforts, and also making sure that needs are met. A lot of times the justification for multiple initiatives is the content that an original producer needs doesn't include a couple or a number of specific fields or attributes that are needed to serve other business requirements and technical requirements. What we want to be able to do is provide a framework and an environment where we can collect and coordinate those collective needs and find ways to meet those in a mutual way. We'll talk a little bit about this idea of win criteria in the GSS, the census area. That's been an area that the pilot that North Carolina has participated in has provided some specific feedback on. And also the need to be able to define and measure the benefits. address data, like several other kinds of GIS data sets, has multiple utility, multiple uses. And in many instances in a traditional public sector kind of environment, you have investments that are born from one line item or one agency's budget that manifest in value and returns in that return on investment equation in other places across government. But we don't do a very good job as a profession and as an institution in being able to track that and be able to demonstrate the mutual benefit, the secondary uses, if you will, across the community. And with frameworks like what we'll be working towards over the next year or so, hopefully we can provide some of that raw data and that material for helping the community understand where the investment points are and where those returns are moving forward. And then finally, when we talk about any sort of process and return on investment equation, we're ultimately working towards a business plan, business case, where we can actually work through the processes, what are the steps, what's the level of effort, what are the resources needed, and how are we going to recommend coming up with those resources within the community. So again, we've sort of talked through with the drivers and then the relationship to the goals, define what the business and technical requirements are, figure out what that workflow is to meet those business and technical requirements, and then finally develop the business model to underpin and support all of that at a very simple level. So right now, this process is being funded through a grant that CGI has secured from the Federal Geographic Data Committee. The end date for this project is March of 2014, so we're approximately a year out. One of the areas that CGIA is challenged with, like many of you, we've had some staff realignment and some staff departures that we're in the process of recruiting and filling. So some of what you're going to see here and some of what we'll talk a little bit about later, the timelines are still being established. We had the original schedule, but now we've got these human factors that have interceded. We've talked with a number of primarily state agencies. You see here, the local government bullet is not just, it's something that we're going to get very detailed into working with other partners as we go through the broadband mapping update, as well as some of the outreach that we've already done to engage those. If I would have listed all of those, we would have had a very full slide with very small names. But you can see here that we've got a broad diversity of potential users and benefactors and contributors towards these efforts moving forward. Any questions about what I've brought up to this point? Okay, we'll talk a little bit here about some initiatives. I've labeled them over the horizon. They're in development, and they're going to be bearing fruit into the future rather. The first that we'll talk about is the Geographic Support System Initiative. This was started by the census as a response to some studies that were funded by, or the studies were done by the National Science Foundation, and recommendations to the census to help do their job more effectively, an evaluation of their management of the 2010 census, the results and the implementation and operations, as well as recommendations for the 2020 census. So this has a very long-term kind of impact and expectation. There were 5 pilots that came out as a result of a September 2011 workshop. One of the pilots that North Carolina was invited to participate in is this concept of local, state, federal workflow to share address information. Presume most folks, I know Mark's in here, but is everybody else here associated with the local government? So you've probably heard of the LUCA process, Local Update of Census Addresses. Generally a very painful process, a once-a-decade kind of process. process where you have to sign paperwork and you don't get feedback from the census. The National Science Foundation folks and even the census leads and census managers understand that's a high degree of frustration, and everyone needs to be able to provide feedback, input to make that process more effective, more efficient, and ultimately more relevant to be able to have a higher quality product. The pilot that we worked on here pilot started after the September 11 workshop. It went through December of 12. There was a final report that was developed at the very end of that process. The pilot participants went to Washington, D.C. in April to see the results of all of the pilots. The final reports from those pilots are being reviewed by Census senior management and the legal folks before it's actually posted publicly. But when that information comes out, I'll be distributing that when it's available to the variety of listservs that are available. The work and content involved the states of North Carolina, New York, Montana, and the Navajo Nation in the Southwest, the Arizona and New Mexico area. And what we evaluated was the idea and context of having local governments where the address data is maintained on a constant basis, being able to share that to a state-level entity like a CGIA for North Carolina and the state shops in New York and Montana, respectively, with the expectation that those state-level organizations would take data on an as-is basis, normalize it to what we'll term later census guidelines, the content that they use for updating and evaluating data into the census's master address file, and then also what could potentially be done, not saying that we're circumventing Title 13, but what are alternatives to Title 13 that would permit the census to be able to share back information of value to the states and to the local governments. So obviously one of the first things you think of is, well, share back everything that's in the master address file and let us be able to update our address and data sets. That was documented in the final report. We did not do any pilot testing on that within our final report. Other examples of areas that were evaluated in the pilot was the establishment of what they call designated areas. It's very technical terminology with the census, but effectively bringing up an ortho, drawing a polygon on that screen, being able to put an identifier on that polygon, and we looked at polygons that were the equivalent of county sizes in Montana, all the way down to areas of less than an acre in the North Carolina and New York examples, and have the census enumerate how many addresses were in that polygon in the master address file, and how many addresses were in the state and local government provided data file. So maybe census says there's 85 addresses in this 1 acre polygon, and the state shows there's 73. That's a starting point. That's potentially valuable information that you can go back and evaluate and update your data sets. Another important area that the census and state and local participants worked on was the context of improvement over time. So going back to one of the things that you hear in the Luca run-up and then also the run-up to the enumeration day is that in 2010, or sorry, let me back up, to 2000, every man, woman, and child that was not enumerated on enumeration day in 2000 represented $1,000 in federally appropriated funding per person per year. If you missed a person on April 1 of 2000, the state and local government combined missed out on $10,000 over the course of a decade. Multiply that times four people per household on average, that's $40,000. If you miss a neighborhood of 100 houses, that's $400,000. Across the context of the state of North Carolina, where we established 4.7 million addresses, if we can pick up a few hundred here, a few hundred there, you start getting into some very compelling figures for why we need to be able to manage this in a more effective way over the course of time. There's a very, very significant return coming back. So part of the pilot evaluation was being able to demonstrate improvements in the master address file over time. So if your accuracy and agreement percentage went from 93% to 95%, how does that look in terms of calculations? How does that look in terms of potential federal apportionment funding coming back to the state and to local governments? That can be very compelling. And looking at that at multiple levels, statewide, counties, municipalities, and local governments, being able to parse that improvement information at that relevant geography level to be able to take back to administrators and to your county manager and to your IT director or to your dispatch coordinator to say, addressing matters and there's a dollar sign attached to it. Those are the kinds of things that we evaluated in the pilot process. Also, to put a capstone on that, with the various other surveys that come along, the American Community Survey, replacing the long form, having more iterations engaged with the relevance of the accuracy of that master address file, again, those pieces of data come into play in a broader context. Another piece of GSSI that was outside the scope of the pilots is indicated here in the last bullet. GSSI also is being expanded beyond just the addressing data, beyond the master address file, into other areas such as boundaries, the boundary and annexation data that gets shared up through the local governments to the Secretary of State's office and then on to census. The center lines in census lingo, that's called features, but getting the integration of all of these data sets together to make more relevant and more accurate census data products are all part of what GSSI is looking to support. We talked earlier about wins at each level. It really goes towards understanding that when you ask a group of practitioners and managers to come to the table, each of those individual participants has a level of expectation and motivation about why they're participating. So what I've listed here is that, again, based on the studies on the 2010 and the recommendations for 2020, GSSI has the opportunity to provide efficiencies and improvements that would result in a $450 million reduction in the administration of the 2020 census. That is a very compelling number if you're a manager of census or the U.S. Department of Commerce. As an aside, this is mainly an evaluation of whether or not targeted canvassing can replace the 100% canvass that happens in between the time of the LUCA submissions and the enumeration date. So they want to be able to have a better geographic database to be able to target their enumeration before April 1 of 2020 and have a significant reduction in cost. They're not committed at this point to pursuing that, but they understand that there is this level of potential opportunity. Now, how that translates into this win scenario concept is that the people that I report to at the state government level, the folks that you report to at the local government level, $450 million in savings in the big scheme of things ends up being 2 or 3 pennies in each of our pockets. I can't take that to my boss and say, we need to be on board and we need to make this a priority and we need to make this one of our top 2 or 3 priorities to help out the census. That's not very practical. And the complement to that is that census acknowledges that they need to do other activities to be able to provide the win scenario for the state and local partners that are providing them their data. So basically it's an investment in their time to provide these additional statistics, to provide the support for this concept of a state or a local, state, federal process that is external to spending dollars on getting better addresses, but at the end of the game, they get a better product. The product that they want to be able to return to the states is more interactive information on data quality and data content, so that they can support us in making the case that addresses are important and need to be maintained over time. And then finally, the opportunity to improve the LUCA process. One of the most straightforward kinds of opportunities that there is that the LUCA process is once a decade. Find everything that changed between 1997 and 2007 is a nightmare. And on top of that, they're not going to share very much information back with you or be able to create a process where you can actually improve your own data set in the ongoing term. Implementing something like GSSI can enable and empower the states and local governments to work together to figure out what is the best case for creating an aggregated data set. Is it once a year? Is it once every 6 months? Is it quarterly, monthly, weekly? The more iterations you do, the more expense you accrue, but at the end of the day, that business case and that business analysis is going to drive you on how much iteration you can afford, quite literally. So having the census and the master address file and GSSI be a participant in all of that can get us elevated beyond that very painful once-a-decade LUCA process and be able to have something that, if it's at least not transactional, at least more periodic, so that it's relevant to the participants at the local government level. This is everything that I have on GSSI, and I feel like I've done a really big brain dump on things that I've been this deep on for 18 months. Any questions or things you want to expand on?
Well, I look at it from our perspective. We already do address maintenance now. Probably everyone has some degree of address maintenance now, because they run a 911 system, they have to put that exact data into AT&T's. So how does this relate? I mean, it seems to me we're putting addresses in as we did them, because we need to dispatch right away potentially to
Right.
places. And so it'd be nice if we didn't have to keep doing this over and over and over again.
You saw me flip through my slides before. That is the next section that we're looking at. Within the 911 community, there's this concept of next-gen 911. At the highest level for next-gen 911, there are two primary motivations. Number one, if you're managing a PSAP or a dispatch center, you can receive calls on a voice line, on a cell phone, on a voice over IP technology, and even now we're seeing social media be a method of incoming request for service. All of those technologies represent vastly different infrastructures and things that need to be maintained within that call center to be able to provide that service. What NextGen 911 wants to do is be able to standardize all of that incoming flow of information into an IP-based system, so that instead of having up to four systems for providing the service, it all gets funneled into one incoming system. The second piece of the puzzle for NextGen 911 that's compelling is that in the current environment for 911 or E911, you pick up the phone, you make a call and say that I need red lights or blue lights to come to my location. The dispatcher locates the appropriate service, rolls the truck, hangs up the phone, that business process is done. In the next gen environment, the PSAP, the dispatch center, becomes a nexus for information flowing to the first responders. So the laptop in the truck, in the police car, the tablet on the firefighter's sleeve will be receiving information from traffic sensors, video cameras, anything that's digital and can be pushed through the air will be part of this process, and the dispatch center goes from being a true dispatch center to being a communications hub. So with part and parcel to all that is that knowing the location of the trucks, knowing the location of where they need to go, knowing the location of your assets, all becomes a geographic problem, or opportunity, if you will, that underpins everything that goes on as part of the process. So towards that end, the State 911 Board had a working group that has been established in, I believe it was February, to develop recommendation plans for the PSAPs in North Carolina to manage the migration towards next-gen 911. Let's see, we've talked about the changing societies, or technologies rather, the geographic responsiveness. The idea in context within next-gen 911 also takes economies of scale and mutual aid support to an entirely different level. Within the standards and the data that will be underpinning next-gen 911, if a hurricane event impacts the coast, in theory, the dispatch process could be handled anywhere else in the state. Folks in Greensboro and Asheville could be doing dispatch routed to them for this geography. The significant outlay and expense of operating a dispatch center currently is an administrative issue that's handled on a local government by local government level. Having the technologies that underpin this, it becomes much more feasible to consider regional approaches for dispatch. So that a group of counties, 5 or 6 or 8 or however many, could come together and manage a single dispatch center for a vast geography if that economy of scale is there, but you have to have the underlying technology and data to support that. And so that leads to some fiscal opportunities where it could be very much, or very attractive, if you will, to a smaller local government in the eastern or western part of the state to go together and contribute towards operating a regional center as compared to local centers. Now, how does this impact us in practice? And this comes back to your question. Within the next-gen community, there is a group called NENA. That's the National Emergency Numbers Association. They have what is called the Core Standards Working Group, and this is the Beanie and Propeller Club. They handle all facets of this technical transition, and it's a combination of both practitioners and industry that comes together to establish the recommendations and standards that the industry is going to respond to. Rachel Bello from Guilford County is actually one of the co-chairs of the Core Standards Working Group. There is a GIS Data Standards document that has been in development since 2011. I was at a national conference in February, and that draft GIS standard is expected to be completed sometime this summer. That's very important because one of the practical kinds of issues is to give me a standard that I can feel comfortable with and I can follow that. And we'll have a slide on that later. This is one of the important pieces to follow moving forward. Because of this reliance on GIS data for dispatch, we've got a couple of very important areas. This idea of horizontal integration, aggregating data sets into a statewide layer, given different standards and given different data formats and content structures, etc., this is going to help standardize some of that. But what's actually more compelling is this idea of vertical integration. Built into this NENA GIS Data Standards document is the concept of vertical fidelity. So if you establish an address point, maybe we'll say it's 123 Dogwood, and you have an adjacent centerline feature with attributes for the address ranges that ranges from 201 to 299, the quality control portion of this data standard will flag that. So in our day-to-day lives and in our profession as a whole, we look at solving that as a matter of professionalism and altruism. We want to get the data as good as we can. When we move to the 911 and dispatch world, that is a completely different facet and opportunity because of the saving lives business case and requirement that point in that feature address range is going to have to be reconciled. And if it doesn't, then the 911 dispatch system is going to throw flags. And so the motivation to get those fixed is going to be very high. But also, in some instances, you might have the address layer being managed by the planning department. You might have the centerline ranges managed by the PSAP or the dispatch center. Those folks are going to have to talk to you, and they're going to have to be able to reconcile that. So that's where we come down here to this idea and concept of a multi-utility data set. Sometimes, just within the Nickel-GISA community, how many folks support everyone except dispatch, and how many folks have dispatch that supports themselves and is in their own part and silo. This is going to challenge that, and that's mostly why I'm here talking to you, because this is going to be something that you will be dealing with in this Nickel-GISA community moving forward. That was a lot of information on NextGen. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, I think so. Obviously you guys are considering that as a way to live with it. I look at the workload we do, and we do a pretty good job in our town just to make sure whatever, like we have one source for this information. And we run into difficulties because AT&T doesn't run certain street suffixes that are standard street suffixes. So you have to translate everything, and it becomes difficult, and because of the way our dispatch system works, we can't have anything that's ABE and have AD, because right. AT&T, that's how the call's going to come in, that's how information is going to be tracked. So everything else in the town is ABE, and everything, when you hit public safety, is AD, and it just, are you going to be able to have enough authority over AT&T, which
I don't have any authority.
to make these kinds of changes, to make addressing and AT&T systems, but there are other things that weigh into this as well, where you are kind of beholden to some entity who doesn't have to change their mind on anything. You have to translate a lot of street suffixes.
Right. And I guess the one thing that I would hold out as hope is that as this data standard gets published, gets into practice, whether it's a telecom provider or a provider of dispatch solutions, everyone's got their mousetrap, and they're going to tell you that their mousetrap is better than the next person's mousetrap. If the standards are the standards, you're either compliant with the standard or you're not. So with these standards, and we'll have a slide on this a little bit later, there's actually a number of standards that are evolving, and it's good news that they're evolving. What's not so clear, but what I would share as professional advice is that there are a number of standards that you need to be aware of, and what are the crosswalks and commonalities and differences among the variety of standards that are out there as an option. Any other next-gen questions? Okay, we'll move to the part of the process that deals with the 2013 update. This, as I mentioned earlier, is a joint project that CGI is the technical lead on with the NC Broadband Group in the North Carolina Department of Commerce. And again, this is funded through FCC monies that are related to broadband encouragement and development in North Carolina. Pardon? Well, NTIA is part of FCC. They are. Okay. The CIO works with their data, so, okay. So the process that we've identified to work with throughout the project, number one, the first part is outreach to local governments. We'll talk about the local government address survey that we did in the summer of last year. Talk about the partnerships and profiles, which were a follow-up to that survey, and also the address NC website. I've actually been active across 3 different states for 17 years, been parts of a lot of survey activities that go on, and honestly, I was incredibly tickled with the results of this survey. The survey was active for 2 weeks in May of last year. We had a grand total, or an ultimate total, of 144 participants, 80 county participants, 44 local government participants, to basically ask them, how is address management done in your local jurisdiction? And a series of, I think it was 18 questions related to that. We wanted to be able to find out who's the authoritative source, who uses the data sets that are provided and maintained by those authoritative sources, what are the best practices that you implement in making your address program successful. This was perhaps the most interesting and compelling piece of that survey for me in terms of North Carolina General Statute says that address assignment and maintenance, authoritative address assignment and maintenance, is a local government responsibility. It stops there. So each local government and authority has the discretion for effectively sorting out their own issue on where's the best place for this to happen. So you can see here that we've got quite the mix between does it happen in the locality's GIS department? Does it come from planning and inspections? Does it come from the dispatch unit? And also we had a number of folks that have dedicated addressing positions or units where this activity takes place. So you see a diversity of groups here. This becomes very important when a group like CGIA is attempting to do an aggregate representation across the state. We can't go to one single organization and say, give me your membership and give me your technical contact and let me go find your data. This is something that I see as very healthy because we've got a diversity of participants and a diversity of people working in the area that we can help umbrella and support. As a follow-up to the survey, there were a number of multiple choice questions. There was also a number of expository opportunities where folks could provide additional information. And when we started looking at the results and the feedback, we saw an opportunity to be able to identify a number of both counties and municipalities that are active in this area that have found success, and we wanted to be able to reach out to those folks with a deeper set of questions. There was a couple of iterations in terms of profiling the type of government, the size of government, how addressing is maintained over time, so that we can put these on the website. If you're new to the activity, you can find a a similar kind of municipality or local government that you can reach out to get more information and more detail. And all of those are, like I said, on the addressnc.net website. The website also has additional information about project status, project activities and scheduling. We also have a forum tool that you can post questions and seek advice from folks and users. And this all goes in addition to the NC 911 addressing listserv that the School of Government maintains. So we want to make that very complementary to the process. In terms of what the next steps are, both for CGIA, the recommendations out to our local government partners. We're going to actually be doing a write-up of the best practices that are common across those profiles. We'll do some outreach webinars to be able to get some of the folks that participate in the profiles and some other new folks to share their stories and activities and questions. The two final pieces of the workflow is developing our internal ingest processes and also the 2013 statewide data collection that we still want to wrap up this year. Those are two significant activities. Again, through the responses in that survey, the back-end support for us is understanding who are the authoritative folks and who do we need to reach out to. Similar to the 2009 effort, we want this effort to be an as-is data collection. We want to make it as low impact and easy for local governments to participate as possible. So whether it's a shapefile, a geodatabase, an address list, we will accept any information that you have and are willing to share with us. Obviously, personally identifying information we would rather have you remove before you send it to us. If you do send it to us, one of the very first quality control things that we do is verify that there is no personally identifying information. We did have this happen in a handful of data sets in 2009. We immediately extract those, and then the archive that we keep is the version without personally identifying information for processing. A number of folks, or data sets rather, may or may not have designation of residential addresses. It's very important to the census folks that a data set that has what the dispatch community calls ancillary addresses or commercial addresses, we want to be able to try to remove those if we can. If they're embedded in the data set and we don't have that capacity, we'll still accept it, but we want to be able to flag that for processing and development of some of the views that we talked about earlier. Again, metadata, I did my master's thesis on it 22 years ago. I understand that it's an overhead process that most folks address, but at the end of the day, if there's metadata metadata record to go with the data set, we very much appreciate that. We're not going to say no if the metadata does not exist. And in our 2009 effort, we actually returned metadata records where none existed. Whether or not we've got the capacity and wherewithal to do that in the 2013 update is still something that we're evaluating. So again, I made the comment earlier about the single-use versus multi-use utility for Next-Gen 911. Again, that's going to be an issue that local governments have to work within their structures to deal with because of the varying standards that are out there and the communication that really needs to take place. In terms of the evolving standards that I teased earlier, the FGDC addressing standard, that was developed by a working group that was primarily spearheaded by ERISA participants. It was in draft when we did our work in 2009. It is actually released as a standard. There are, I don't want to say pros and cons, but there are differences across the data standards, particularly between the addressing standard and the NENA GIS data standards to be aware of. You want to be able to educate yourself on those. The census has released guidelines. The guidelines is effectively, if you're involved on the technical side, everything that they need for the master address file. They are resisting, or they're specifically using the phrase guidelines as opposed to standard, because they are willing to accept data that meets the guidelines. The concern is if they call it the census standard, that folks will interpret that as a binary of either it is completely adhered to or not. And again, the census is also in this as-is kind of understanding that the best data is going to come from the local participant, but there may or may not be a field, or it may not be parsed exactly as they want it. They're willing to work with either a state partner like us or within their processes to be able to support that. And then finally, FHWA Map 21, Federal Highway Administration. These are the folks that collect the gasoline tax, share that back with the states, dependent on the states meeting certain criteria in terms of submitting and sharing data up to or back with the federal government. The standards that highway departments at the state level have been required to meet in the past have been provision of interstates, federal highways, and state-maintained highways. MAP 21 standards are being evolved and developed literally as we speak, since it started last summer, also pushed down to locally maintained roads, which traditionally has been outside that domain. So there's also an opportunity here, even though the center lines deal with just the center lines, the integration of the address data sets and the center lines for both the next gen purpose, the census purpose, and also your everyday kinds of purpose. All of this is evolving and spinning together and will be changing over time. Hopefully we can use initiatives like GSS and Next Gen 911 to sort that out in a series of recommendations to local governments and get the feedback and participation in what works for your environment and what perhaps doesn't work for your environment. Long period of talking for me. Questions from anybody else?
I had a couple different meetings that I attended related to the census. They were talking about returning to the local government on maybe a 2-year cycle, and then they backed off from that to a 5-year cycle. Having been through 2 LUCA updates myself, I'm curious as to what the determination was. What was their decision?
In terms of how that process relates to what they're doing now with GSS, it's a mixed bag. Fortunately or otherwise, since North Carolina was part of that local, state, federal pilot, they are working with the regional geographers assigned to North Carolina and CGIA, so that CGIA will be that request point. And we've already worked on that a little bit this year to get data sets that they want to use for volume testing. The pilot was a handful of states and actually a handful of local governments within those states. They want to be able to ramp that up from a dozen participating data sets to approximately 300, so they can get some handle on production metrics and what this could potentially mean for national processing of all this extra things that they don't do today. In states that were not part of that pilot one, i.e. the other 47, they're still having the regional geographers go to the individual local governments. And nothing in that pilot is suggesting that census is not going to be a direct contact resource for local governments. It's just an opportunity to streamline the process. In terms of the 2-year versus 5-year, that's also part of that pilot one documentation that the state and local governments need to come together to sort out what makes sense for them. I would anticipate that the 5-year request is related to the 5-year American Community Survey cycle, which will be derived from that master address file resource. Effectively, what they heard very emphatically from the local and state government participants in that pilot is work in an update cycle that makes sense in our footprint. So if Census wants to come and force an update cycle, it's pretty much get in line. So some of the business processing and business analysis that we want to be able to do for this FGDC project, we actually want to embrace and include Census so they can get, is it a 2-year cycle? Is it a 5-year cycle? Is it a 1-year cycle? They're still trying to wrap their brains around if I was in a state where my colleagues are for Delaware and Rhode Island, where you've got 4 and 3 counties respectively, we could probably do a monthly kind of cycle. For a state like North Carolina or the larger states, those cycles get expensive. So whatever comes of that business analysis to drive how much iteration we can afford, we want the census to be integrated with that, not external to that. Is that tap dancing, or does that answer your question? There's not a definitive answer.
That's okay.
I'm here to entertain. So I mean, the answer's fluid. The census, like many other federal organizations, when you meet with the senior geography staff, like we were in the workshop 3 weeks ago, versus the regional staff, big organization, not necessarily mixed messages, but messages that may not align. It's not because anybody's doing anything bad or nefarious, it's just the volume and size of the organization, and also the number of facets that they have in the context of what it takes in an organizational management kind of dynamic to set policy and implement policy. A piece that I will share from the meeting 3 weeks ago, and this is all exploratory at this point, but Title 13 applies to the Census Bureau. The Census Bureau and NTIA and FCC working together were in North Carolina and I think 16 other states were using NTIA funds to provide a foundation for address maintenance. Census and those partners at that federal level are looking at ways in which perhaps the FCC CIO's office could be the maintainer of an address file that Census would draw from. The idea being that that FCC CIO's office is external to Title 13. So if the states and locals can feed the CIO's office and be able to have that, I think one of the main frustrations is, besides once a decade, is the not being able to have good communication and feedback and be able to derive better data in your data set compared to what you're sharing with Census because of that Title 13 restriction. If the CIO's office were to take that on, the data that the CIO's office maintains, potentially in partnerships with local and state governments, would not necessarily be subject to Title 13. But then Census giving feedback to the FCC CIO's office in terms of content, structure, requirements, they could draw from that as an intermediate party and not be Title 13 bound. That is conceptual at this point. There's no definitive answer. I would be surprised if they would have this sorted out in the next 12 to 18 months. The fact that they're considering it is worth throwing a party. Last slide here, in terms of our last couple of slides, the aggregation workflow that we're developing inside of CGIA, that will be, again, the as-is basis. We want to be able to focus on new, updated, and retire records compared to the 2009 activity. Theory being that the overwhelming majority of address records that we collected in 2009, we know if 123 Dogwood was there in 2009 and it's there in 2013, and the coordinate representation is very, very close, if not exact, we can safely ignore it. We can spend our limited resources on finding the new addresses that have been created since 2009, addresses that have been modified or updated, and retired records from 2009 that aren't there in the source data moving forward. What we want to be able to do is build this production database to represent the master set of requirements that were documented in that process analysis or that business analysis earlier, and then be able to share data out from that. We know that not every local government has that residential flag. That's okay. But we want to be able to support that in the production database so that we can have database views of the production database or even web services coming out of that database to be able to support the needs of multiple applications and application-specific requirements. Like I said earlier, our primary points of contact, that's one of the ancillary benefits of why we did the survey before, to be able to sort those folks out. In the 20 or so that we didn't talk to the first time around, obviously we'll be reaching out to the GIS units and the P staffs to find the appropriate folks to talk to. Right now, we're looking at approximately a 3.5-month period. After we get the process in place, we're going to need internal staff for a 3.5-month period to make the data request, do the QC, do the integration in the production database, and then being able to push out the remaining materials. So, the takeaways. We want to be able to develop support for consistent use of high-quality address data all levels of government. We don't want to be prescriptive, we want to be supportive. We want to be able to maintain this idea that every organization that comes to the table has a motivation and an expectation for success, and not everybody that comes to the table has the precise, exact same need, but the fact that we're documenting that can be very helpful in negotiating and understanding what's important to this group and what's important to another group, and where we find that middle ground. Finally, multiple sources of standards are coming into focus. Not all of them are set in stone, some of them still have flexibility, all of them will have some impact on address management going forward. There is my contact information. So with that, we've got a few minutes left over for questions. Wow, I covered everything. Okay, thank you very much.